a silent instrument, a vanished man, and a melody no one dares to finish. Welcome to the Mysterious Casebook. I am your host, Michael. This growing community amazes me. Drop a comment and share where you're tuning in from. Your thoughts always brighten my day. Let me know below. Now let's begin. The ivy-framed cottage of Mr. Octavius Ridley stood at the edge of Chipping Dene like a well-preserved relic of another century, with weathered stone, climbing roses, and latticed windows that always seemed on the verge of whispering a secret. It was the sort of place the village liked to forget until the sound of music, faint and haunting, floated from the open parlor windows. A harpsichord, no less, played with slow and deliberate precision. The notes were like moths fluttering in candlelight, beautiful, tragic, and a touch unsettling. Mr. Ridley had moved to Chipping Dene 6 years prior after retiring from a long and obscure career in chamber orchestras on the continent. A tall man with silver hair, an angular face, and a gait that still suggested elegance even as age stiffened his joints. He lived alone and spoke little. Most villagers assumed his past was glamorous. There were rumors of a Parisian scandal, of a wealthy widow, and even of a duel once fought over a musical slight. But in Chipping Dene, he was simply the eccentric with a harpsichord and a monocle, who fed the birds with slightly too much ceremony and never came to the church fete. Which is why his unexpected agreement to host this year's Garden Society gathering caused such a ripple through the local social circles. Mrs. Fanshawe, the chairwoman of the society, took credit for the feat, though Miss Letty Briggs swore she had planted the idea during one of her rare conversations with the gentleman. Regardless of whose persuasion had worked, a date was set, and the invitations, handwritten in a curiously calligraphic script, were sent. That Sunday dawned bright and blue, the kind of early spring day that makes even the most seasoned gardener optimistic. Guests arrived bearing homemade lemon cake, floral arrangements, and opinions. Lawn chairs were arranged in neat arcs beside the herbaceous border, while younger helpers served elderflower, cordial, and cucumber sandwiches on fine china borrowed from the church vestry. Miss Marple, invited at the urging of Mrs. Banbury Smith, who always believed a proper gathering required a keen-minded listener, arrived promptly at 2. She wore a pale lavender dress and a straw hat adorned with a single feather, and carried a small notebook in her handbag. Not for any particular reason, she said, but simply because you never know when you'll come across an unusual recipe. She sat quietly through the opening speeches, sipping her tea and observing. She noted how Octavius Ridley stood to the side, neither host nor guest, his gaze flickering from the camellias to the crowd to the table with the cakes. He didn't eat. He didn't smile. And his hands, long-fingered and veined like old parchment, were clenched behind his back. It was Miss Gilda Cartwright, a woman in her late 30s with a tight perm and tighter opinions, who took it upon herself to ask Mr. Ridley for a performance. "Something light, Mr. Ridley," she said, gesturing toward the open drawing-room where the harpsichord glimmered faintly in the late afternoon sun. "Nothing funeral. You know, for the mood." He declined, politely but firmly. Then, just as the conversation turned to the perennial problem of aphid infestations, a sound sliced the air. Not music, but a sharp, discordant crash, followed by the unmistakable shattering of glass. Every head turned toward the house. Mr. Ridley was already moving swiftly, surprisingly so for a man of his age. By the time the guests reached the drawing-room, a strange stillness had fallen. The harpsichord sat untouched. A crystal vase lay in pieces across the polished floor, and near the velvet drapes, crumpled like a fallen coat, lay the lifeless body of Mr. Ridley himself. It was Mrs. Fanshawe who screamed first, but it was Miss Marple whose eyes narrowed not in horror, but in quiet calculation. There was no sign of blood, no broken neck, and no visible injury. Just Ridley, dead at the foot of his beloved instrument, one arm stretched toward the open keyboard. The expression on his face was unreadable. Not surprised, not pained, almost resolved. By the time the police were summoned from Market Allingham, the garden party had dissolved into whispers. The cordials were untouched, the cakes, melting under the sun, sat forgotten. And Miss Marple, standing just behind the constable as he knelt to inspect the scene, noticed something no one else had remarked upon: a single harpsichord key slightly depressed, as if recently played, one note out of place. She made no comment, of course, just folded her hands in front of her and murmured softly to herself. It's curious, isn't it, how the past never really stops playing its tune. By Monday morning, the entirety of Chipping Dean was humming with speculation. As was the custom in such places, news had travelled faster than the police telegram. Those who had not attended the garden party felt especially entitled to dissect the tragedy, as if their absence had lent them some superior insight. The postmistress claimed to have noticed something peculiarly distracted about Mr. Ridley's expression a week prior. Mr. Partridge, the village butcher, declared with theatrical certainty that he had never trusted a man who ordered only lentils and imported sardines. The general consensus, or rather the one gaining the most traction at the tea counter in Woolno's grocery, was that Mr. Ridley had suffered a silent stroke. Mrs. Fanshawe was the primary champion of this theory, repeating it at every opportunity in the faintly superior tone of one who had once attended a lecture on cerebrovascular anomalies at the Women's Institute. A stroke? No, doubt, she said, nodding sagely to a group of women gathered by the rhubarb display. He was nearing 80 after all, played that dreadful instrument with too much tension, and he was dreadfully reclusive. Those sorts often have weak hearts. No wonder. Miss Letty Briggs, who had a particular distaste for anything that smacked of finality, refused to accept the medical explanation. He looked fit as a foxglove. I saw him lifting a bag of compost just last week with bare hands, mind you. You can't tell me a man like that just keels over without reason. Others, such as Reverend Lyle, leaned toward a more spiritual line of inquiry. God calls us when we are ready, he intoned solemnly during the Tuesday evening prayer meeting. Perhaps Mr. Ridley had completed his purpose. Miss Marple, who attended the same prayer meeting seated beside the vicar's wife, listened quietly, her head bowed. She did not mention that she had seen Mr. Ridley only hours before his death, or that she had noticed, rather distinctly, a faint red impression near his temple. Not a bruise precisely, but something peculiar all the same. She kept that to herself, much like she kept her observations about the harpsichord key. There was a time and place for such reflections, and a village prayer meeting was neither. The police had been professional, but brisk. Inspector Roland Cray, a stout man from the Market Allingham station with a florid face and a habit of quoting his own reports, had examined the scene and declared the death unexplained, but not suspicious. There was, as he pointed out, no sign of forced entry, no injury to speak of, and no missing valuables. Mr. Ridley's will had already been lodged at the solicitor's office months before, naming no relatives but leaving a generous donation to the National Conservatory of Music. His papers were in order, his affairs tidy. Elderly man, living alone. Dropped dead after an emotional day, Inspector Cray summarized at the end of his visit. Likely heart failure or some cerebral event. Post-mortem will tell, of course, but I shouldn't think there's more to it. Miss Marple thought otherwise. Not out of obstinacy, but because something about it all struck a wrong chord. Not dramatically, so no shrieking inconsistencies or glaring holes, but a subtle dissonance, like a note held too long or an echo in the wrong key. On Wednesday morning, she received a call from Mrs. Banbury Smith. "Jane," the voice crackled over the line, "I simply must talk to you. I've been terribly unsettled. Could you come round this afternoon? There's seed cake if that tips the scale." It did, marginally. And Miss Marple had been curious about the good lady's thoughts. She made her way through the cobbled lanes, noting the shuttered windows of Ridley's cottage as she passed. It had already taken on the peculiar stillness that overtakes the homes of the recently deceased. Mrs. Banbury Smith welcomed her with the usual flurry of gestures. "Do. Sit, Jane. The fire's not quite out. Mind the tabby." "Oh, let me just fetch the Darjeeling," before settling across from her with a sigh. "You were there, Jane," she began, voice lowered despite their solitude. "Did you notice anything odd?" "In what sense?" Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle. "Only that it didn't feel right. I can't explain it. One moment he was standing there, all buttoned up and quiet. Next, he's well gone." "And the vase, Jane. Why was the vase broken if no one touched it?" "Why?" "That is a curious detail," Miss Marple admitted, stirring her tea. "And then Gilda Cartwright. Did you hear her afterwards? Going on about how it was probably nerves and excitement. Yet she was the one who insisted he perform. She practically demanded it. Why push him if she thought he was so delicate?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. People often try to control the narrative after an unexpected death. It helps them soothe their conscience. Mrs. Banbury Smith leaned forward. "Do you think it was murder?" The question hovered, sharp and uninvited. "I think," Miss Marple said after a pause, "that people do not often die in the middle of an ordinary Sunday unless something extraordinary has prompted it. And if Mr. Ridley's death was natural, then it was most unusually timed. If it wasn't, then someone at that gathering knows more than they're saying." A heavy silence settled between them. "Do you believe Gilda Cartwright had something to do with it?" Mrs. Banbury Smith whispered. Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead she asked, "Has Miss Cartwright always been fond of music?" "Oh no," said Mrs. Banbury Smith, blinking. "She hates anything classical. She's said so dozens of times. I prefer wireless dance music, you know." "Curious," Miss Marple murmured. She left soon after, notebook unopened, thoughts quietly percolating. It wasn't only Gilda Cartwright's odd behavior. It was the way Mr. Ridley had looked around the garden as if seeking someone, the way he had not played, though his harpsichord had been tuned, the faint scent of something chemical near the vase, camphor perhaps, and that curious indentation on his temple just above the ear. By Thursday, talk had begun to settle. The next church bulletin made no mention of the incident, and Reverend Lyle had resumed his usual sermons on temperance and neighborly love. But the village itself remained oddly strained, as if bracing for another crack in its genteel facade. And Miss Marple, seated by her parlor window knitting a scarf for the vicar's Christmas fair, considered her next step. The police had no interest in further investigation. The villagers had already moved on to discussing a missing cat and an unusual batch of raspberry preserves. But Miss Marple had questions and a quietly growing suspicion that Mr. Ridley's final note had not been played by chance. The charm of Chipping Dean lay not just in its flower-laden lanes and ivy-clad cottages, but in the illusion of simplicity. It was a place where days passed gently, morning deliveries of milk, midday gossip outside the post office, and evenings spent with the wireless humming softly in the background. But beneath the rhythmic surface was a pulsing web of observation, hearsay, and inferences, something Miss Marple understood better than most. By Friday, the weather had turned. A cool mist settled over the rooftops, and the air was laced with the scent of damp earth and lavender. Miss Marple, never one to waste time in idle curiosity, decided it was the perfect day for a series of informal visits. Not interviews, certainly not interrogations, but small, well-timed encounters with the very people who had been present on the afternoon of Mr. Ridley's death. Her first stop was Woolno's grocer's, ostensibly to purchase a tin of condensed milk. Miss Letty Briggs, never one to miss an opportunity for discourse, was rearranging the biscuit tins with great flourish and an even greater sense of self-importance. "Ah, Jane, can you believe the fuss? Honestly, you'd think this village had never seen a natural death before, she exclaimed, her voice rising half an octave in righteous irritation. And now the vicar's talking of grief counselling circles. I told him it's not grief, it's curiosity. Miss Marple smiled as she handed over her coin. You were near the drawing room when it happened, weren't you, Letty? Letty puffed up slightly. Of course I was. I was the first to see that something was off. That vase, I always said it was far too fragile to be kept on a pedestal. And did you see Mr. Ridley before he entered the house? I did, actually. He looked distracted. Didn't say a word to anyone. Just slipped away. Not rudely, just quietly. You know what I think? Letty leaned in. I think he knew. I think he felt it coming. Like a dog sensing a storm. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps. But that didn't quite align with what she remembered. Mr. Ridley's expression hadn't been fearful. It had a certain edge, perhaps even watchful. And that suggested something else entirely. Her next stop was the lending library tucked behind the church hall. Gilda Cartwright was working there that afternoon, stamping returns and cataloguing paperbacks with brisk efficiency. Miss Marple entered casually, selecting a slim gardening almanac from the shelves and waiting until Gilda noticed her. "Oh, Miss Marple," Gilda said, managing a tight smile. "No more mysteries for you today." "Just pruning tips," Miss Marple replied lightly. "Though the world seems rather full of mysteries at the moment." Gilda's smile faded a little. "I wanted to thank you, actually," Miss Marple continued, lowering her voice to a confidential tone, "for urging Mr. Ridley to play. It would have been such a treat to hear him. A pity he declined." Gilda hesitated, setting aside a stack of books with unnecessary force. "Yes, a pity. Did you know him well?" Miss Marple asked. "Not particularly. He wasn't approachable. And he kept to himself. But he was a brilliant musician, or so everyone said. I just thought it would lighten the mood. A bit of music. Something lively. That drawing room felt like a tomb. There was something brittle in Gilda's tone, defensive, perhaps, as though she were pushing against an accusation that had not yet been made. Miss Marple watched her carefully. "Of course," she said, "music does lift the spirits. But not everyone enjoys classical pieces. You prefer the wireless, I believe." "I never said that," Gilda snapped, then caught herself. "I mean, I enjoy all sorts. It depends on the mood." Miss Marple tucked that away. It wasn't the contradiction that interested her so much as the anxiety behind it. She departed the library without comment, walking slowly back toward the high street. Along the way, she passed the Ridley cottage again. The curtains had been drawn shut, but someone had left a small wreath on the gate, a cluster of white heather tied with a ribbon, a gesture, perhaps, or an apology. The effect was somber and oddly theatrical. At the far end of the street she encountered Inspector Cray stepping out of the bakery with a paper bag in hand. "Miss Marple," he called cheerfully. "Still hunting shadows, are we?" "Only knitting patterns," she replied. "And perhaps inconsistencies." Cray grinned. "Still convinced your old instincts are sharper than forensics?" "I never underestimate either," she said with a twinkle. "Might I trouble you with a small question, Inspector?" "For you, always. Was anything found in Mr. Ridley's pockets? A note? A vial? Anything out of place?" Cray looked momentarily puzzled. "Nothing unusual. Wallet, house key, and a handkerchief. No signs of poison, if that's where your thoughts are headed. Cause of death is still listed as inconclusive pending further analysis, but we're leaning toward stroke or aneurysm." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes, that is what I assumed would be said." "You don't agree?" "I don't disagree," she replied, ever polite. "I only once knew a woman who suffered from a series of dizzy spells. Everyone thought it was nerves. It turned out her husband had been adding camphor to her tea for months. Not to kill her, of course, just to keep her docile. The inspector gave a half-laugh. "Always a story with you." "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly. "And every story is made up of details. The ones we overlook are often the most revealing." By the time she returned home, the clouds had thickened and a soft drizzle fell across the village. She lit a fire in her sitting room and settled into her armchair with her knitting. She considered everything she'd heard that day. Letty's claim that Ridley had looked distracted. Gilda's strange defensiveness about music. The untouched harpsichord. The faint trace of camphor she thought she'd detected. The broken vase. The slight indentation near Ridley's temple. 1,000 little notes in a discordant chord. She looked at the scarf in her lap and murmured aloud, "People think murders begin with motive. But often they begin with embarrassment or fear. A single moment someone's trying to hide." The rain began tapping at the windows like quiet footsteps. Miss Marple leaned forward and reached for her notebook at last. It was time to make a list. By Saturday morning, the rhythm of chipping Dene had begun to reassert itself. The village green, damp from the recent rain, hosted the weekly flower stall once more. Baskets of primroses and foxgloves lined the iron railings, and the smell of loam mingled with the cinnamon tang from the bakery's morning buns. Children skipped with skipping ropes. The constable made his rounds, nodding cordially to everyone, and yet, beneath the usual village bustle, a quiet unease lingered like a note that would not resolve. The mystery of Mr. Ridley's death still hovered over the town, not spoken of as urgently, perhaps, but whispered with renewed interest in the private corners of shops and kitchens. The villagers were not immune to closure, and with the police offering none beyond vague medical jargon, imaginations had been left to fill the gaps. It was during this period of limbo that suspicion, almost inevitably, found a comfortable home. The first to fall under village scrutiny was Tobias Greaves, the late Mr. Ridley's gardener and odd jobs man. Tobias, a man in his mid-40s with perpetually muddy boots and an air of being just slightly out of step with the world, had worked for Ridley since the man's arrival in Chipping Dene. He was known for his loyalty, if not his conversational finesse, and could often be seen whistling tunelessly to himself while pruning hedges or oiling the garden gate. He was the only one with a key, besides Mr. Ridley, Letty Briggs declared while selecting potatoes at Woolnose. That's what I heard from Elsie, who heard it from her cousin who works for the solicitor. Miss Marple, browsing the tea selection nearby, made no comment. Gossip often bloomed in the most fertile soil of partial truths. Tobias's supposed motive, the theory continued, lay in money. Some said Ridley had promised Tobias something in his will and then changed it. Others insisted Ridley had dismissed him a week prior in a fit of artistic pique. Neither claim had evidence behind it, but that did little to slow the current of speculation. "He's been acting strange," said Mrs. Fanshawe, who had only spoken to Tobias once, years earlier, when her cat had escaped into Ridley's garden. "Twitchy. He keeps looking over his shoulder like he's hiding something. And he was the one who found the body, wasn't he?" "Hardly," muttered Miss Marple to herself later, recounting that it had been the group of party guests, including herself, who had arrived at the drawing-room en masse. Tobias had not been among them. Still, Miss Marple made a point of taking her afternoon walk past Ridley's cottage that day. She paused by the gate, where Tobias could be seen raking the leaves that had collected along the garden path. He looked up when he noticed her, hesitated, then gave a tentative nod. "Good afternoon," Miss Marple called gently. He straightened his back, leaning slightly on the rake. "Afternoon, miss. I imagine it's quiet, working here now." Tobias gave a shrug that was more a gesture of discomfort than indifference. "Too quiet, if you ask me. I can't bring myself to go near the harpsichord room. Not that I ever had reason to before. You were fond of him, weren't you?" The rake paused in mid-air. He was a fair man. Didn't speak much, but he never shouted. paid on time. Trust me, Miss Marple observed him carefully. There was grief in his face, not exaggerated, but honest. Lines around the mouth, tension in the shoulders. She noticed a cut on his palm, half-healed. May I ask, did Mr. Ridley ever mention feeling unwell before last Sunday? Tobias shook his head. Not to me, though he did seem bothered the last few weeks. Didn't say why. Started locking things up. He never used to lock. Changed the cabinet key in the drawing room. Kept his letters close. Miss Marple's eyes flickered. Letters? Foreign ones, Tobias said. Came with odd stamps. He always read them in the garden, then burned them in the brazier. I only know because I had to clean the ashes. That was news. Miss Marple gave him a small smile. Thank you, Tobias. You've been most helpful. She left him to his leaves, already filing away the image of burning foreign correspondence. It painted a slightly different portrait of the quiet musician, one touched with secrets and shadows. Her next visit was to the parish archives, where Mr. Silas Coombs, the part-time historian and full-time busybody, maintained a chaotic filing system that would have driven most librarians to tears. It was not the parish records she was interested in, but the opportunity to speak with Silas himself, a man who knew more about the residents of Chipping Dean than most of them knew about themselves. Mr. Coombs, she said, leaning lightly on the edge of the counter. Do you remember anything about Mr. Ridley's early years in the village? Silas, a tall, angular man with large spectacles and nicotine-stained fingers, leaned back in his chair. Strange bird, he said. Kept to himself. Rented the cottage from a solicitor in Bristol and paid a year in advance. No family, no pets. He spent most of his days playing that infernal instrument. And his visitors? Rare, except for one. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. Oh, woman. Middle-aged. Stylish. Visited every few months, stayed no longer than an hour. Always left looking pale. Did you ever catch her name? Afraid not, Silas said, adjusting his spectacles. But I'd wager she wasn't local. Too polished. Had that London air. Miss Marple left the archives with more questions than answers. A mysterious visitor, burned letters, a gardener with quiet loyalty and a wounded palm, and a locked cabinet in a house where little had seemed worth locking. And still, the village's eye remained fixed on Tobias Greaves. At supper that evening, over a modest stew and a slice of sponge cake, Miss Marple reread her notebook. One name had begun to emerge as the most convenient suspect. Tobias, with access, motive, and proximity. But convenient suspects were rarely the correct ones. She knew human nature far too well. A crime committed in shadow was rarely the work of someone already standing in the light. She closed the notebook and set down her spectacles. There was someone else who had stood very near the drawing room that day. Someone who had not seemed surprised by death, and someone, Miss Marple suspected, who had far more to lose than any gardener ever could. But she would need something more than instinct before speaking aloud what she already feared to be true. Sunday came again, quiet and contemplative, with overcast skies and the toll of the church bell calling villagers to morning service. A week had passed since Mr. Octavius Ridley's sudden death, yet the atmosphere in Chipping Dean still retained a peculiar sharpness, as though the village had drawn in a breath and forgotten to release it. Miss Marple arrived at St. Modwin's in her usual seat, the third pew from the front on the right-hand side, just behind Mrs. Fanshaw's feathered hat. The sermon that day concerned the parable of the wheat and the tares, cautioning against judging too hastily, lest one uproot the good along with the wicked. Miss Marple, who rarely allowed herself the luxury of irony, noted the relevance with mild amusement. After the final hymn, as the congregation drifted into the churchyard, exchanging condolences and rhubarb recipes in equal measure, Miss Marple made her way, not to the vicar, but to the parish warden, Mr. Lionel Kent. A thin, meticulous man with a liking for exact times and exact tea temperatures, Mr. Kent had also been, unbeknownst to many, the caretaker of the Ridley property in Mr. Ridley's earlier years, handling occasional repairs, firewood deliveries, and the rewiring of the drawing-room sconces. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said as she approached. "What a service. Quite thought-provoking, though I must say I do wish they'd tune the organ. A half-note off in the Gloria is jarring to the trained ear." "Perhaps you might assist me with something equally jarring," she replied kindly. "It's about Mr. Ridley's drawing-room. You once rewired it, I believe." He blinked. Yes, I did. At his request, wanted the wall sconces switched to separate switches. Odd fellow, had very specific preferences. Did he make other alterations? Mr. Kent thought. Now that you mention it. Yes. He asked me to install a small locking mechanism on the drawer of his writing desk, flush with the wood, barely visible. Quite expensive, too. He said it was for sensitive correspondence, though what sort of letters a man like that received I couldn't guess. Miss Marple nodded. "And did you happen to see what was in that drawer?" "Heavens, no. My job was just mechanics, but I do recall he tested it 3 times before he was satisfied. Precise chapter, a hidden lock, a drawer of letters. It tied in too neatly with Tobias's remark about the foreign post. Yet when Inspector Cray had catalogued the items found in the house, there had been no mention of such a drawer or any private correspondence." Miss Marple's next visit was to the Ridley cottage itself. The constable on duty, young Archer, fresh-faced and well-meaning, had seen her approach with some hesitation. "I'm afraid I can't let anyone inside, Miss Marple. Instructions." "Of course, dear," she said, unoffended. "But might you do me a favor and check something?" "Not an intrusion. Simple confirmation. You'll find a mahogany desk in the drawing room with narrow mahogany legs and brass handles. Middle drawer. Would you mind seeing if it appears tampered with or unusually crafted?" Young Archer, flattered by the assignment and perhaps a little charmed by her twinkling deference, agreed with a nod and vanished into the house. He returned several minutes later, frowning slightly. "There is a drawer, just as you said. Very neat work. But it's empty. Completely. Not a speck of dust, even. Feels like it was wiped out." Miss Marple's expression remained unchanged, but inwardly, something clicked into place. A concealed drawer. Emptied. Cleaned with intention. "Thank you, Constable. You've been very helpful." She turned away slowly, her mind already racing ahead. Someone had accessed that drawer before the police arrived, either immediately after the death or just before. Someone who knew it existed and had reason to remove what it contained. If Ridley's death had been staged as natural, then the motive might lie not in violence, but in silence. Something in those letters, something dangerous, had prompted fear or panic. And if those letters had been destroyed or hidden, then it was likely done by someone who knew precisely what Ridley was safeguarding. Back home that evening, Miss Marple allowed herself to revisit her earlier conversation with Gilda Cartwright. The defensiveness about music, the contradictory claim about her musical tastes, her insistence on a harpsichord performance she later pretended not to care about. It had seemed curious at the time, but now it seemed purposeful. Had Gilda known about the locked drawer? Was her insistence on a performance something public, something staged as a deliberate distraction? And then there was the curious matter of the broken vase. Most had accepted that Ridley had knocked it over in a fainting spell, but Miss Marple had noted the position of the shards. Too far from the body. Angled, as though displaced by someone entering or leaving the room in haste. She reached into her handbag for the small slip of paper she had tucked there the day after the party. The torn corner from a theatre. Program. She had found it near the parlor's skirting board, half hidden behind the side table. At the time it had seemed too trivial to mention. Now Its significance deepened. The program was for a London concert held just 3 weeks prior, featuring, among others, a harpsichordist named Rosalind Greaves. Greaves, the same surname as Tobias, the gardener. A coincidence, perhaps. But Miss Marple had ceased believing in coincidences long ago. Connections, yes. Coincidences, no. She examined the slip again, noting the faint impression of initials written on the back in pencil, O.R. Octavius Ridley. Suddenly, the lonely old man with no visitors and a life of solitude seemed far less isolated. Could it be that Ridley had been in contact with a performer, perhaps a former student or protégé, someone with a connection to music, to Gilda, or even to Tobias? The web was beginning to stretch in multiple directions. But something else struck her. Ridley had once been part of a chamber ensemble, quietly, almost modestly. A man of precision, privacy, and considerable discipline. If he had chosen to retire in Chipping Dean, it had likely been to escape something or someone. And yet, in his final months, he had taken to locking away letters, tuning his instrument more regularly, and agreeing, rather uncharacteristically, to host a village event. Was it guilt, anticipation, or was he luring someone? Miss Marple folded the slip of paper and returned it to her handbag. The pieces were still scattered, but one thing was clear: this was no spontaneous death, nor a crime of passion. It was something colder, older, rooted in long-standing fear or knowledge, perhaps revenge, perhaps blackmail, or perhaps something far more subtle, a sin not committed recently, but long ago. She reached for her knitting, but her fingers barely moved. Her eyes stared into the fire, lost in thought. Not all secrets die quietly. Some compose their own final movement and wait for the right hands to play it. The following morning broke with a sharp east wind that rattled the panes of Chipping Dean's gabled roofs. The village appeared bundled against itself. Windows shuttered early, scarves knotted tightly, and even the gossip seemed subdued, as though nature itself had adopted a tone of reticence. But Miss Marple was already out. She moved with a sense of gentle purpose, her coat buttoned neatly and a small parcel wrapped in brown paper tucked under her arm. Her first destination was the modest cottage occupied by Tobias Greaves. The garden gate squeaked as she passed through, and Tobias appeared moments later from around the shed, his boots muddy and sleeves rolled to his elbows. He paused when he saw her, surprise flickering behind his weary eyes. "Morning, miss." "I do hope I'm not disturbing you," Miss Marple said kindly. "Only I found this in my pantry and thought you might appreciate it." She held out the parcel. Inside, wrapped carefully in wax paper, were a half-dozen honey scones. Tobias accepted them awkwardly, murmuring thanks. "I was hoping," Miss Marple said gently, "that I might ask you one more question about Mr. Ridley." Tobias looked down at the scones, then back at her. "If I can help, you mentioned that Mr. Ridley had received letters, foreign ones. Do you recall any return names or marks?" He shook his head. "No names. Just odd stamps. Mostly German or Austrian, I think. I don't read any of it, mind you. Just noticed it." Miss Marple gave a thoughtful nod. "And he burned them, every time. I watched them go black like it was part of a ritual. A ritual. Or an erasure. Do you happen to know," she asked casually, "whether Mr. Ridley had any family?" "Not that he ever spoke of." But Tobias hesitated, scratching the back of his neck. "There was a woman once. Showed up unexpectedly about a year ago. Stylish, sharp voice. They argued, quietly, but you could feel it. She left after 15 minutes. He didn't come out for hours after that." Miss Marple's expression barely shifted. "Did she give a name?" "Number, but I think she might have been someone from before." Before. That vague yet telling word so often used in the village when referring to wars, scandals, or personal tragedies. It confirmed what she had begun to suspect. The past had returned to Chipping Dean, and it had not come for tea. Her next visit was to the library, though not for books. Gilda Cartwright was again on duty, seated at the front desk with a clipboard and an air of careful composure. Miss Marple approached with a small smile. "Good morning, Gilda. I do hope I'm not interrupting anything terribly important." Gilda looked up quickly. "Not at all, Miss Marple. Just the quarterly inventory." "Ah, the tyranny of forms." She set her handbag on the counter and folded her gloved hands over it. "I came because I've been thinking about that afternoon at Mr. Ridley's." Gilda stiffened, ever so slightly. "I remember how insistent you were that he play. It struck me as odd, given your stated dislike for classical music." Gilda's face colored slightly. "I never said I disliked it. I only like livelier tunes." "Of course," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "But I wonder what made you so interested in hearing him play when you've never shown much curiosity about him before." There was a silence. Gilda glanced away, fiddling with the edge of the clipboard. "I suppose I just wanted to see if he still could. He always gave the impression of someone hiding something." "And were you trying to draw him out or see him slip?" At that, Gilda looked up sharply. Her lips parted, but no answer came. Miss Marple studied her for a moment longer, then gently withdrew a folded piece of paper from her bag. "I found this at the Ridley cottage. It's from a concert program, featuring a harpsichordist named Rosalind Greaves. Any relation, do you suppose, to Tobias?" Gilda blinked. "You know, I've never heard of her." "You're quite certain?" "Yes," she said more firmly. Miss Marple tucked the slip back into her bag. "Well, no doubt it is a coincidence. Funny how often those occur just when things begin to feel most tangled." She left the library in a thoughtful hush, her mind sifting through Gilda's hesitation. Lies were never as telling as the effort it took to sustain them. Later that afternoon, she stopped in at the vicarage under the pretense of dropping off wool for the ladies' charity knitting circle. The vicar's wife, a woman of ready smiles and excellent fruit preserves, ushered her into the parlor with a cup of tea and a scone. "I've been wondering," Miss Marple said, after commenting on the apricot jam, "whether the vicar keeps a copy of all funeral records." "Oh yes, indeed. Even preliminary notes." "Is there someone in particular?" "I thought perhaps Mr. Ridley. I was curious whether his estate might eventually be handled locally." The vicar's wife hesitated. "Actually, Reverend Lyle mentioned something unusual. Mr. Ridley left a note, a sealed one, in the church's custody. He brought it himself the week before the garden party." "Did he say what it was?" "Number only, that it should be opened in the event of public concern." "We didn't know what that meant, but with everything that's happened, would you permit me to see it?" Miss Marple asked, her voice still gentle. There was a pause, then the vicar's wife nodded and left the room. She returned with a cream envelope, unsealed now, and handed it over. Inside was a single page, handwritten in fine cursive. "To whom it may concern, if I am found dead in the drawing-room, know that it was not my wish. I have lived quietly and mean to end quietly. If the past comes to claim me, so be it, but I will not name names. I trust someone will see what I could not prevent." Oh. Ridley, Miss Marple, read it twice, then folded it carefully and handed it back. "A peculiar man," the vicar's wife said softly. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "and one who sensed something approaching long before the rest of us did." That evening, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the clouds roll past the moon. She thought of the broken vase, the hidden drawer, the slips in Gilda's stories, Tobias's loyalty, the vanished letters. Secrets were like seeds buried long in the soil. Most never saw the light again, but some, when watered by fear or shame, they pushed their way to the surface, and now at last Miss Marple felt the threads beginning to gather. Soon she would have to tug one and see what unraveled. It was just after dawn on Monday when the second shock rippled through Chipping Dean. Not as jarring as the death of Mr. Ridley, perhaps, but unsettling enough to stir gossip from behind half-opened curtains and draw constables to the scene with brisk, uncertain footsteps. Mrs. Fanshawe, who had risen early to collect gooseberries from her back garden, was the first to spot the smoke-thin, bluish trails curling upward from the rear of the old outbuilding behind the Ridley cottage. Alarmed, she summoned the constable at once, and by the time the fire brigade arrived, the structure was a charred husk, its roof caved and soot-blackened walls still hissing from steam. It had been a shed of sorts used by Ridley for storage, perhaps, though no one could say for certain. What mattered now was that whatever had been inside it was gone. Burned. When Miss Marple arrived, summoned by a well-meaning neighbour who believed she ought to know, the constable was already pacing. Young Archer again, his cheeks flushed with uncertainty and soot. "I don't understand it," he said, flustered. "No sign of foul play, no accelerant that we can find, but the fire started from within. Someone meant to destroy something. That's clear enough." Miss Marple looked past him to the crumbling skeleton of the shed. "And what was inside, do you think?" Archer shook his head. "Hard to say. Just blackened beams and melted hinges now. There's no indication it was a workshop or tool shed. No identifiable remains. No fragments of paper," she asked quietly. "No curled metal frames, ash-touched ink." Archer blinked. There were pieces. Charred slivers, almost like the edge of a file folder, but nothing readable. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but inside, a slow confirmation formed. Whoever had removed the letters from Ridley's hidden drawer had not simply taken them away. They had destroyed them. First the desk, now the shed. The effort to erase the past had grown more desperate and more reckless. She turned her gaze toward the narrow path that led from the Ridley cottage to the back gate. A trodden trail of damp soil and shoe prints, now blurred by the firemen's boots. But something still caught her eye. A snapped sprig of honeysuckle, freshly broken. Someone had passed through in haste. That someone, she thought, had known precisely what they were doing. By late morning, the news had spread. The village square hummed with fresh theories, most of them wide of the mark. Some insisted the fire had been set by the solicitor to claim insurance. Others whispered that Ridley had been hiding stolen art, chart continental works, no doubt smuggled in through his supposed orchestral tours. Miss Letty Briggs told 3 different people that she had always suspected the shed. "Too neat," she said. "Always locked, never used. And I saw a light there one night last spring. Pale green, like a ghost lamp." Miss Marple let them chatter. She had other matters to attend to. Her next stop was the post office, where she requested to see any remaining mail addressed to Mr. Ridley. The postmistress, a woman of sharp eyes and immaculate ledgers, hesitated only briefly before obliging. "Only one piece came after the death," she said, retrieving a brown envelope from the back shelf. "I came from abroad. France, I think." Miss Marple examined the handwriting. Slanting script, elegant but hastily done. The postmark confirmed it. Paris. She turned the envelope over. It had already been opened by the inspector and its contents replaced. She asked to see them. Inside was a single letter, unsigned, in French. Miss Marple's language skills, though rusty, were still quite serviceable. She read silently, eyebrows slowly rising. "Dearest O, you were right not to name me. I cannot forgive myself for how things unfolded, but the truth would have destroyed us both. I kept your last letter as a kindness, but I am sending this so you know I did not forget. Please do not let guilt undo what little peace you found." No surname, no direct reference, but confirmation nonetheless. She asked to make a copy and left, letter in handbag, thoughts circling like crows over a barren field. That afternoon she found herself once again at the Greaves' cottage. Tobias answered the door with an expression of surprise. "Miss Marple, I was hoping you might indulge me with one more question." Tobias nodded and stepped aside. His sitting room had a sparse but tidy, well-worn armchair, a kettle just beginning to boil on the stove, and a shelf lined with old garden almanacs. She sat, smoothing her skirt. "Tell me, Tobias, did Mr. Ridley ever mention a woman named Rosalind?" There was a moment of stillness. Then Tobias sat down heavily. "She was my sister," he said at last. "Rosie. Younger by 10 years. Brilliant. Played the harpsichord like no one else I've ever heard. She went to study abroad when she was 19. Paris, then Vienna. She never came back." "Did she know Mr. Ridley?" "Yes. More than now. He was her tutor at first. Then something else. I never knew the full of it. Just that she returned home once. Just once, in the spring of '48. She was different. Quieter. Afraid, maybe. She wouldn't say what happened, only that she couldn't go back. Not to music. Not to him." Miss Marple's eyes gentled. "And you never spoke of it? What was there to say? She died 5 years later. Illness, they said. But she faded more than she died. And Ridley? Never contacted us again. Until last year." Tobias reached into a drawer and handed her a letter, worn at the creases. "I'm sorry for everything. I've lived with regret, and it has made a recluse of me. Your sister deserved better. If you will allow it, I would like to explain." Miss Marple read it slowly, then looked up. "Did you meet him?" "Number I couldn't. I couldn't sit across from him and not see her face. And now?" Tobias met her gaze. "Now, I wonder if I should have. Maybe if I had, none of this would have happened." Miss Marple rose slowly. "There are moments in life, Mr. Greaves, where silence seems the kindest choice, and others where it becomes a burden. But guilt is not the same as guiltiness." She paused at the door. "Thank you for your honesty, and for loving your sister in a way that matters still." She walked back to her cottage with a growing certainty. Someone had tried desperately to erase Ridley's history to silence him before he could speak, but too many fragments had slipped through the cracks. The ghost of Rosalind Greaves hovered behind everything now, not a spectre of vengeance, but of unfinished sorrow. Miss Marple sat down by her hearth and opened her notebook. There, in careful cursive, she wrote a new heading: "Who needed Ridley silent forever?" And just beneath it, one name. Not Gilda, not Tobias, but someone hiding in plain sight, rehearsing innocence with theatrical precision. The time to draw the curtain was near. By midweek, the wind had shifted over Chipping Dean. The biting chill gave way to stillness. No breeze stirred the trees, and no church bell broke the silence. It was as if the village were holding its breath, waiting. And Miss Marple, seated in her parlour beneath the ticking clock, felt that peculiar hum that comes when a mystery begins to align itself like notes on a page. She had not gone to the police. Not yet. Inspector Cray, good-natured though he was, would have dismissed her conclusions as conjecture. There was no poison, no blood, and no forced entry. But Miss Marple did not need those things. She had human nature, and that, in the end, was always the sharper blade. She closed her notebook and placed a single envelope beside her on the table. Inside was a brief letter, written in her finest hand and sent earlier that morning. She had addressed it to Gilda Cartwright. It read, "My dear Gilda, I find myself in possession of a letter Mr. Ridley wrote shortly before his death, one he clearly intended for someone close to him. I believe it may have been meant for you. If you are free for tea this afternoon, I should very much appreciate your company. Warmly, Jane Marple." It was not a lie. The letter existed. Whether it was written for Gilda or simply useful to place in her mind was another matter. Promptly at 4, the knock came. Miss Marple opened the door to find Gilda standing there, shoulders stiff and lips taut in a polite smile. "Thank you for coming," Miss Marple said warmly. "Do come in. I've just brewed the Darjeeling, and I hope you'll forgive the addition of ginger biscuits. My sponge failed me this morning." Gilda murmured something agreeable and followed her in, eyes quickly scanning the room. Miss Marple saw it. The faint tension behind the glance, the subtle check of the sideboard, and the quick survey of the mantelpiece. Gilda was looking for the letter. They settled into the parlour, the tea poured, the biscuits untouched. Miss Marple spoke lightly at first of the weather, of the vicar's latest sermon, and of the unfortunate state of the parish roses. Gilda responded with distracted civility, but her eyes kept returning to the envelope on the table. At last, Miss Marple picked it up. "I thought," she said, "that you might recognize the tone. I'm afraid I haven't opened it yet. I dislike reading things not meant for me." Gilda hesitated, her fingers tightening around the teacup. "Perhaps it isn't meant for me." "Perhaps not," Miss Marple said, mildly. "But I believe you and Mr. Ridley knew each other better than most realized. The way you looked at him that afternoon, there was familiarity and resentment. A flicker too quick to name passed over Gilda's face. "I only asked him to play," she said carefully. "That hardly makes me a confidant." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but it does make you someone who wanted the room's attention focused elsewhere." She let the words hang in the air. Gilda placed her cup down with deliberate slowness. "If you're suggesting I had something to do with his death—" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said gently, "that you've spent a long time pretending to be someone you're not." A long silence followed. Then Gilda laughed dryly and brittly. "What a curious thing to say. I've made a study of people," Miss Marple said, "and you, Miss Cartwright, are far too refined in your movements for someone who claims never to have trained in music. The way you held yourself at the library and the way you moved through Ridley's drawing room was not unfamiliar to you. And then there's your reaction to the program slip I found. You said you'd never heard of Rosalind Greaves." She leaned forward slightly. "But you had, because you were her." Gilda's face froze. Miss Marple continued, voice quiet but firm. "You were Rosalind Greaves, Tobias's sister, the young harpsichordist who vanished from concert programs and returned once to Chipping. Dean changed. You abandoned your name, your profession, and perhaps even your family because of something that happened with Octavius Ridley. But you could never quite let it go, could you?" Gilda's voice, when it came, was low. "You don't know what you're saying." "I think I do," Miss Marple replied gently. "You came back to the village under a new name, became someone else entirely. You kept your history buried, but when Ridley moved her so close, so quietly, you must have been terrified." "No," Gilda whispered, almost to herself. "He said he wouldn't place a hand over the envelope. I believe he wrote to you, didn't he? Maybe not in this one, but before. You visited him once, argued, then left, and he stayed silent, out of guilt, perhaps, or fear. But guilt and silence are unreliable allies." Gilda closed her eyes. "Yes," she said finally. "Yes, I was Rosalind. But you don't understand. He didn't just ruin me. He made me vanish. I had no choice. My reputation and my prospects were gone in an instant. I had to create someone else. And when he agreed to host the garden party, you saw it as a threat," Miss Marple said softly. "You thought he might be preparing to speak, to tell someone." "I couldn't risk it," Gilda said. "Not after all these years, not after I'd built a new life." "So you retrieved the letters," Miss Marple said, "and later you burned what was left in the shed. But did you kill him?" Gilda looked away. "No," she said after a long silence. I didn't touch him. I wanted to confront him, yes. I found the key, and I opened the drawer before the guests arrived. But when I went back that evening after the party, I found him already dead. Miss Marple said nothing. I panicked, Gilda continued. I saw the letters in the drawer were gone, and I thought someone else had found them. I broke the vase. Not on purpose. I dropped it when I heard someone outside. Then I ran. I never expected she stopped, breath shaking. Miss Marple reached out, her voice kind. Sometimes, secrets trap the keeper as surely as the one they're meant to shield. But I believe you. Gilda looked up, eyes wet. Why? Because I think the one person Mr. Ridley truly feared wasn't you. She stood and walked to the window. And I think, she added softly, that you are not the only one hiding behind a new name. Behind them the clock struck 5. The pieces were in place. Gilda was not the murderer, but she had been the match that set the stage. The true player, Miss Marple now realized, had been waiting in the wings, rehearsing their next move with quiet precision. And very soon she would bring down the final curtain. The following day broke grey and damp, with a low mist settled over the hedgerows like a woolen shawl drawn tightly over the village's shoulders. It was the kind of morning where one instinctively whispered, where teacups clinked more softly, and where footsteps along cobbled lanes echoed longer than they should. At 10:30, Miss Marple stood in the church hall, a place more often used for flower shows, sewing circles, and the occasional damp rehearsal for the annual nativity pageant. But today, she had quietly asked a few individuals to gather. Not many, just enough. Present was Inspector Cray, curious but skeptical, seated with a notepad tucked beneath one elbow. Gilda Cartwright, pale but composed. Tobias Greaves, his hands shoved into his coat pockets. And Mrs. Fanshawe was uninvited, but having caught wind of something afoot, she'd swept in with the air of a society matron summoned for moral judgment. Miss Marple stood near the lectern, a modest presence in her lilac cardigan and sensible shoes, her expression calm. She did not pace. She did not lecture. She simply looked at them all with that gentle clarity of hers, like someone preparing to dust a bookshelf others had long abandoned. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice soft but firm. "What I am about to share may cause some discomfort, but I believe the time for unspoken things has passed." She turned to Inspector Cray first. "You said there was no sign of foul play, that Mr. Ridley's death bore the marks of natural causes. I agreed at first, but as you yourself noted, there was something curious, a bruise just above the temple. Faint, but present." Cray gave a slow nod. "We chalked it up to a fall." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "But that would have placed him near the table or the corner of the instrument, and yet the body was found clear of both, and the vase shattered several feet away. The positioning felt staged." She let that linger before continuing. "But more than the physical evidence, what troubled me was the psychology. Mr. Ridley was a man who had made peace with his pastor, so he wanted to believe. But in the weeks before his death, he changed. Locked drawers, burned letters, hosted a garden party. That last detail is especially out of character." She turned to Gilda. "You were afraid he meant to expose you, and I understand that fear. But you did not kill him." Gilda remained very still. Nor did Tobias, despite being the most convenient suspect. No, the person who killed Octavius Ridley was someone he trusted enough to let into his home at the most vulnerable hour. She turned slowly to Mrs. Fanshawe. The room seemed to constrict. Mrs. Fanshawe blinked as if caught mid-thought. "I beg your pardon?" "You were the last to leave the party," Miss Marple said. "You returned to the drawing room to retrieve your gloves. That was your excuse, at least." "I did no such thing," she said, sitting straighter. "You did," Several people saw you re-enter the house. You were gone only a few minutes, but that was enough. The door to the drawing room was still ajar. Ridley had remained behind, and unlike the others, we were not surprised when he died. Mrs. Fanshaw's lips thinned. This is absurd. I thought so too, at first, but then I found something. She reached into her handbag and removed a folded piece of paper, a copy of the letter found in Ridley's desk, one he had written shortly before his death. It read, in part, "I trust someone will see what I could not prevent." But this is the key, Miss Marple continued. When I asked myself who benefited most from Ridley's silence, it wasn't only about protecting the past, it was about control, status. Mrs. Fanshawe, you've spent years curating your position as the village's moral center. But that role was built on something rather fragile, wasn't it? Cray leaned forward. What are you suggesting? Miss Marple didn't look away. During the war, Mr. Ridley was stationed with a cultural outreach team. A translator and a musician, he traveled between London and Paris. And in that time, he witnessed certain transactions. Names passed, documents traded. And among those names, one stood out. She looked directly at Mrs. Fanshawe now. Your name wasn't always Fanshawe, was it? You were Marguerite Laval, a French liaison, later naturalized under a new identity. Ridley knew that, and he kept your secret, until he no longer could. Mrs. Fanshawe's face had gone very white. I discovered this only recently, Miss Marple said gently, when I found an old photograph in the parish records sent years ago for a wartime tribute. You'd signed it, M. Laval. A slip, perhaps, but not one I could ignore. Mrs. Fanshawe said nothing. The silence was brittle. You killed him to stop him from speaking, Miss Marple concluded softly. Perhaps he threatened to reveal your past. Perhaps he only alluded to it. But whatever it was, you panicked. You saw your carefully constructed life begin to tremble, and you silenced the one person who knew the full truth. Tobias spoke for the first time, his voice rough. And the fire, the shed. I believe, Miss Marple said. Mrs. Fanshawe broke in after the police had left, hoping to recover or destroy any lingering papers Ridley might have hidden outside the main cottage. It was desperate, but she was clever enough to act as though she were merely concerned, even leading speculation toward Tobias and Gilda. Cray stood, his face grave. Mrs. Fanshawe, I must ask you to come with me. We'll need a full statement. The older woman stood slowly, her expression unreadable. For the first time in years, her composure cracked, just slightly. He told me he would forgive me, she said almost to herself. He said the past didn't matter anymore, but I knew he didn't mean it. I saw it in his eyes. And then, quietly, she followed the inspector from the room. The silence that followed was thick with disbelief. Tobias looked stunned. Gilda, tearful. Miss Marple exhaled softly and reached for her handbag once more. I think, she said gently, we might all be ready for a cup of tea. The case, for all intents and purposes, was closed. But something still lingered in the air, an ache not entirely soothed by justice. For what had been lost in Chipping Dean was not only a life, but also a version of history long buried and at last unearthed. And Miss Marple, ever the observer, knew that when people buried secrets, they rarely expected them to grow roots. 2 days later, a quiet rain returned to Chipping Dean, not in downpours or storms, but in a steady, drizzling curtain that softened the landscape and muffled the world to a hush. The hedgerows shimmered with moisture. The thatched roofs glistened, and inside each cottage, kettles hummed, logs crackled in hearths, and the business of the village resumed, tentatively, as it always did after something dreadful had passed through. Mrs. Fanshawe had not returned. The police had taken her into custody with little fanfare. No formal charges had yet been laid, Inspector Cray had confirmed it would take time, but her departure had left a hollowness behind, as though the clock at the village square had lost half a chime. For all her airs and certainties, she had been a fixture, and fixtures, like habits, are mourned more than expected. The Garden Society postponed its next meeting. The church organist, in quiet irony, chose not to play at all on Sunday. And Woolnoth's grocers sold out of tea biscuits by mid-morning, the result of increased traffic from neighbours seeking conversation under the pretence of errands. In the midst of it all, Miss Marple remained composed. She had, for the most part, returned to her knitting and gentle routines, though she received several unannounced visits from villagers under the thinnest of pretences. "You must be terribly relieved, Jane," said Miss Letty Briggs, standing with a basket of rhubarb no one had requested. "Imagine, her of all people, and to think she judged us all so freely. It's always the ones who clutch their pearls the hardest, isn't it?" Miss Marple merely smiled and said something about rhubarb preserving best with ginger and a touch of lemon peel. But when the door finally closed behind her visitor, she sat for a while in stillness, staring into the rain-silvered window pane. There had been no triumph in solving this mystery, no theatrical flourish, no vindication. What she had exposed was not a dramatic crime of greed or jealousy, but a long, drawn-out tragedy stitched into the quiet corners of respectable lives. It was late afternoon when Gilda Cartwright came to call. She wore no hat this time, her hair was pinned back simply, and her posture lacked its usual stiffness. She looked younger, somehow less defended. "May I come in?" she asked. Miss Marple nodded and led her to the parlour, where the fire still burned low and the tea had already been poured. "I wanted to thank you," Gilda said, settling into the same armchair she had occupied during that unforgettable encounter just days before. "And to tell you something about Rosie." Miss Marple gave a quiet nod, hands wrapped around her teacup. "We weren't just sisters," Gilda said. "We were rivals, in a way. She was always the brilliant one, the one with talent. I had poise, I suppose, and ambition, but not her gift. When I left for the continent, I thought I would reinvent myself, not just as a musician, but as someone important. Then I met Ridley." She looked into the fire, her voice low. "He offered me everything, opportunity, training, a future. But there were conditions, unspoken ones. He didn't force anything, but there was a kind of power in his approval. I told myself I was in control, that I was just being clever. Her eyes were distant, but when I refused him finally, clearly he made sure no one else would touch me. The concerts dried up, the letters stopped. I became invisible overnight." Miss Marple said nothing. She merely sipped her tea and waited. "I returned to England ashamed," Gilda continued. "And Rosie had changed too. She tried to help me, but I was too proud. I vanished into a new name, a new village, and a new life. Then last year, I saw him. At the market. He didn't even recognize me. But I recognized him, and every part of that old fear came flooding back." She swallowed. "I went to him, tried to make him remember what he'd done. He apologized. I don't know if he meant it. He said he'd been a coward, that he had been cruel without violence, that he was sorry Rosie had died." "And were you?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Yes," Gilda said. "Not because she died, but because I never forgave her for surviving what I couldn't." The silence stretched for a time. Then Miss Marple set her teacup down. "You are not the only one in this village who wore a different name," she said. "And you are certainly not the only one who suffered in silence." Gilda nodded, her throat tight. "What will happen to her?" "Mrs. Fanshawe," Miss Marple said. "There will be inquiries. Her true identity will be confirmed. But it's not the courts alone who deliver justice. Sometimes exposure is its own verdict." Gilda's eyes shimmered, but she held them steady. "Will they forgive me?" she asked. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Some will, others won't. But forgiveness, my dear, is not always the gift of others. Sometimes it's what you must decide to give yourself. That evening, the rain eased, and twilight cast the village in soft hues of violet and grey. Tobias Greaves could be seen tending to the cottage garden, though the house now sat empty. He did not whistle as he worked. At the post office, the final letter addressed to Mr. Ridley remained unclaimed, left to yellow slightly on the edge of the shelf, and Miss Marple, seated once again beneath her parlour window, finished the last row of her knitting. It was a soft blue shawl meant for the charity auction at the next spring fete. But as she folded it across her lap, her thoughts were not of wool or stitches, but of the complex weave of human hearts. The ways people protect themselves, the lies they tell, the shame they carry, and how sometimes a village's greatest mystery is not the death of one man, but the lives of those left behind. She reached for her notebook, turned to a fresh page, and wrote 3 simple words. The past whispers. Then she closed it gently, set it aside, and listened to the quiet of the evening, where for once no harpsichord played, no secrets stirred, only the sound of rain returning softly to the earth.